And I was like, no, I'm a poet. Poetry is the thing I love more than anything. And I said to this kid, my relationship with poetry is such, I don't need a mistress. Prose is the dumb guy I go to hockey games with. I'm going to begin with the first chapter and maybe a little bit later on. What you need to know. Johnny Malice was born Johnny Malucci, and there you go, a whole name change thing right there. He's a punk musician. He's the youngest son of an Italian-American family in Queens. And his older sister is Angela. Angela glanced again around the living room at the pictures her father had left standing in frames of the small bookcases. There were photos of her and her two brothers at various ages. Her wedding picture with Paul, they looked so happy then. And her older brother's wedding photo, Anthony's tuxedo, his hair still dark and curly, while Francesca, with the short nun hair, as their younger brother described it, smiled, her round cheeks glowing like the moon. On the dining room table stood the memorial board, snapshots of her father as a young man in ROTC and again in his NYPD Blues, a wedding photo of his own with Anthony and Angela's mother. It's the early 1960s and he has Kennedy hair and is laughing. Another wedding photo of her father with Johnny's mother, who was pregnant with Johnny at the time, although Angela and Anthony didn't know it then. It's 1971 and he sports mutton chops and a mustache. Polaroids of her father holding each of his 3 children were mounted beside retirement photos, union photos, and photos of him in uniform at the Columbus Day Parade. In these pictures, it is easy to track the passing of time. Her father's hair slicked back and longish in the late 1970s, her father's hair shorter and more conservative in the Reagan 80s, graying a bit and a little longer again, thinner and whiter in the Clinton 90s. She turned from the memorial board and avoided completely the photo album beneath it. She had had enough of the recollections of her father's fellow officers. The cousins had all left, as had the neighbors, and the guys he'd retired to Atlantic City bus trips with. Anthony had gone upstairs, back into the main part of the house where he lived with Francesca and their 3 daughters. Even now, she was sure, the 5 of them were holding hands, arms crooked at the elbows, hands upward, praying the Our Father. She could practically hear it. She wondered where Johnny was. She looked at a photo of her dad with Johnny at his high school graduation. He's a handsome boy in a white shirt with a skinny tie loose at the neck, the collar buttons unholstered, and his long neck showing the slight blemish of a hickey. The boy smiles, a dimple in his left cheek like their father had. His eyes, though, are dark and peer at something beyond the camera, and his hair is bleached white against his olive complexion, giving him a comically menacing look. Later that day, he would dye it purple against their father's wishes, but right then it glows above his head like a halo he wished he could discard. "Johnny, where are you?" Angela asked the air. It wouldn't pay to call his cell again, for he wouldn't answer. That was understood. She would leave messages and he might call back. In her phone, his number was listed under his middle name in case Anthony or her father were ever to look. Not that they ever did, but she knew they would have been upset to learn that she'd been in contact with John. In her father's kitchen, the mourner-delivered foodstuff had been sorted and put away. She opened the fridge and took out a jar of maraschino cherries. Her father had loved them, on ice cream or on cake, but he would too sometimes just open a jar he kept in the fridge, fish one out by its stem, and then pop it into his mouth. "Getting my serving of fruit," he used to say when she and her brothers were kids. And she smiled. For her father, they were always delicious. Maybe if he'd eaten real fruit and not candied fruit, he would be here today, she thought. Maybe if he'd spoken to his youngest son in the last 15 years, he would still be here. Maybe if he'd stopped being a cop after he'd retired, passing judgment, waiting to catch each of his 3 kids breaking the law, even rules he himself had broken. Her father, for instance, although divorced twice, hated the fact that she divorced Paul, just like he hated that Paul was English Protestant years before that, having said, "They're okay with divorce, remember that." Her father, too, hated that Johnny had divorced, that Johnny had not gone to college, that Johnny had run off from the family the way he had never done, that Johnny was playing music and had tattoos and God knows what else he was doing. Johnny was a punk, her dad said, and he meant it to mean hoodlum, petty criminal, no goodnik. Johnny said he was a punk, too. He just meant it differently. For Johnny, it meant music, rebellion, a hearty fuck you. For Johnny, being a punk was a source of pride. She poured a glass of Chianti from the bottle that they had opened earlier. She looked at the dark red of the wine. It was practically the color of Johnny's hair the last time she'd seen him. "Can you pour me a glass?" a girl's voice asked from behind her. Angela twitched and spilled wine over her fingers. "Aren't you too young, Jessica?" She reached for a paper towel beside the sink. "Come on, Aunt Angela, I'm almost 18. What do you think? Daddy's going to find out you corrupted me?" She stuck out her tongue. "Besides, Grandpa always served this wine. He believed in it. She used to always come down here after school when Mom and Dad were at work. They did puzzles and stuff. God." She crossed her eyes. "I don't think Beth really understands. She's crying, but I think it's because everyone else is crying." She sipped again. "I couldn't stay up there any longer." "Did you come down here a lot?" "Sometimes. I don't know." She looked over her shoulder. Angela felt the room grow cold. "Aunt Angela, can I trust you?" "I'm your aunt." "I know. Look, it's like I have a secret." Angela imagined the confession of her teenage niece. Stories about time spent in a boyfriend's basement, Friday night parties with some friend's parents' liquor, illicit trips into Manhattan, and lies to her parents. It would be nothing she hadn't done at 18. "Do you think I'd sell you out to your dad?" "Ah, he's such a deacon." Angela laughed. She wondered if the girl knew that her father used to be such a Guido. She held her niece's hands in hers momentarily. "You can trust me. Promise." "Look at this." The girl walked over to a small old-world cabinet in the living room and opened the lower door. A stack of CDs practically fell out. Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Louis Prima. Angela knew those songs. She'd listened to her father sing them while driving with him as a child. They were playing whenever she visited. This is how she thought of him. Her dad smoking a Marlboro, drinking Chianti, crooning along at his kitchen table. She shuddered at the thought of her dad, suffering emphysema, still smoking. "Jess, what are you doing?" "I want to show you something. You're not going to believe what Grandpa had." She sorted through a plastic case. "Got it." She lifted a CD over her head, and another, and a third. Angela looked over her shoulder toward the door, and then back down at her niece. "Are those what I think they are?" "Yeah, Uncle Johnny's band. These discs are badass. Have you listened to them? Can I put them on?" Does your dad know Grandpa had these?" "Fuck no!" Jess blushed when she heard herself curse in front of her aunt. They both laughed for a long minute, and it felt good to laugh, felt good to release. Like Grandpa, he came upstairs one day, about a year ago. He said to me, "Angela," he patted my cheek the way he did. You know how he was. Yeah, holding on to the mannerisms of his old world parents. That was my dad, still driving to the old neighborhood to play bocce. Yeah, he could be cute. Angela smiled. She wondered how her ex-cop father would feel about being called cute. Anyway, so Grandpa comes upstairs. This was right after he was diagnosed. I don't remember where everyone else was. They were out someplace. I didn't want to go. And Grandpa says to me, "Angela, sweetheart, I hear the music you play. It's slow, so loud, all that guitar and distortion." He actually said distortion. Jessica sipped from her glass. "Anyway, he says to me, 'Your father thinks he's protecting me. He doesn't talk to me about your Uncle Johnny, but you listen to music like your uncle plays. Tell me, do you have John's records?'" Aunt Angela, I didn't know what to say. I fucking love Uncle Johnny's music. Riot Shield is such a good band. Do you know them? Have you heard one of these CDs? Angela nodded carefully. They're so good. Jessica practically squealed. She opened one of the cases and pulled the CD from it. This one's my favorite. Do you know their song Queen of the Subways? Sometimes I like to think it was written for me. She stood up smiling. Angela looked at the familiar CD case from the girl and removed the liner notes from it. It was their fourth album, Returning the Favor. The cover art was an upthrust fist. Each member of the band was superimposed on it, their heads right beneath the knuckles. She unfolded the booklet. She imagined her niece picking this album out for her father and skipping past their third record, Dead Man's Switch, because the title might have offended the dying man. She looked closely at a picture of her brother. The dimple is still there, his hair dark and spiked. In the photo, he's got a guitar hanging from his shoulder, and which he clutches at the neck, and he's singing into a microphone. Under it, it says Johnny Malice, vocals and guitar. Johnny Malice, not Malucci. Your grandfather hated that John changed his name. I can imagine. But when Grandpa asked me about Riot Shield, he didn't even talk about that. He just wanted to hear it. He said Johnny had a great voice and he wanted to hear him sing again. So I played him some songs. She shook her head, sending her hair in motion. I didn't even know Johnny Malice was my uncle for a long time. They both sat on the 1970s rust-colored couch. Jessica scattered the jewel cases on the coffee table. What's your favorite? That's hard. I mean, I love Queen of the Subways, but I think this one, she leaned forward and lifted their fifth CD, More Lies About the Truth. This one is just one great song after another. They played 4 shows in the city when this came out, and Dad would not let me go. God, it's such bullshit. She kicked the coffee table. Dad wouldn't let me go when they had a slot on Warped Tour either. Angela sighed. Your uncle upsets your father. And my mom, too. Angela laughed. Your mother never got over the fact that one of Johnny's bands was called Grace's Period. Jessica laughed again, a sweet adolescent one. Being with her made Angela feel younger. It was just shocking and young and stupid. This was when your mom and dad were working through wedding plans. They were 25. Johnny was 16. She'd never met anyone like him before. I mean, neither had we, but he was our brother, even if we only saw him on weekends and holidays. He was so smart and so in your face. He had such attitude, like he was always keen for an argument. And here is your mom and dad coming back from meeting with a priest and talking about traditional values. It was a bit tense. It's just hard to believe they're related, Jessica said. I mean, I used to try to tell people that Johnny Malice was my uncle, and they just nod at me. I told one boy I wanted to impress, though, and he didn't believe me at all. I thought I would show him, and then I couldn't even go see Riot Shield play. I felt like such an idiot. How'd I end up with my dork father anyway? Her eyes teared up. It's okay, sweetheart. Your mom and dad think they're protecting you. They're overprotecting me is what they're doing. Do you know my friend Heather offered to go with me to the Rocking Reese Park concert? Riot Shield and Agnostic Front and like 10 other bands were playing. It wasn't going to cost me a cent. It was a Saturday. I wasn't going to miss school. I wasn't going to miss church. So many of my friends were going, and Heather had an extra ticket, but I couldn't go. Do you know why? Angela shook her head, and Jessica continued. They don't like Heather. Heather's in college. Heather's DJ name at the Stony Brook radio station is Heather Heathen, and Heather didn't go to Catholic school, and Heather likes bands with names like Bad Religion, so Heather is a bad influence on me. Why? Because she's old enough to drink legally? Because she doesn't care what people think? Please. I don't want that sort of protection. Aunt Angela, they've wrapped me up in so much bubble wrap, I can't breathe. Just like your grandfather did to me, Angela said, squeezing the girl's hand. I didn't turn out all bad. Sometimes I wish you were my mother and not just my godmother. Angela nodded. So, can we put on one of these CDs? I think we should probably wait till everyone goes to sleep upstairs. I would hate for your father to come down to hear it. I told Heather once that Johnny Malice was my uncle, and she didn't believe me. She didn't say I was lying, but I can tell she didn't believe it. She looks at how Dad treats me, and she can't imagine they're brothers. She comes over, and there are no pictures of him, of us, so why should she? It's not just your dad's fault that your uncle hasn't visited, not your grandfather's fault either. I love John, but don't make him the hero in all this. Angela watched her niece roll her eyes. She didn't know Johnny, so she didn't know what he could be like. She had an idea of him from interviews and song lyrics in her own imagination, and no aunt was going to be able to undo that. Will you tell me a story about Uncle Johnny? Will you tell me what happened? What had happened? Angela wondered. The story, which she lived and heard versions of, always seemed incomplete. Where could she begin? She imagined her father listening to Johnny's music, or at least looking at the CDs, his eyes closed, his jaw tight, but maybe still a slight proud smile. A cigarette would be slowly burning itself to its end in the ashtray, and he would inhale from it and wheeze and cough as he did at the end. He would not have bobbed his head to the beat. He would not have turned the volume up. Such gestures would have been out of character. Still, he would have listened the way he had sat through her dance recitals, sat through Anthony's Little League games. Her father hadn't told her about the CDs, about his listening to Johnny sing again. It was obvious Anthony didn't know either. She shook her head. Dad, she said, could still surprise me. This is wow. She thought about what might be in his bedroom or in the safe deposit box at the bank. Suddenly, the possibilities of what they might find seemed limitless. She wondered if Johnny would actually show up before the 10 o'clock funeral mass. Potential surprises abounded. She looked at her niece. Sure, I'll try to tell you whatever you want to know, though really, there's not much there. Despite her smile, Angela's cheek softened and she bobbed her head. Or maybe I don't know how to tell it. I was there for a lot of it, and I don't understand it. But I'll tell you this, I'll try. Her father had been sitting on this couch listening to John's CDs, and she hadn't known. Anthony hadn't known. John hadn't known. Her niece, her goddaughter, was growing up. You know what else, Jessica? What? You should come over sometime and visit, maybe for a weekend. I have Johnny's old records. You do? Angela nodded. I don't have a record player anymore, but we can get one somewhere. Even though I got rid of all my other albums years ago, I held on to those. I mean, he is my younger brother. That is so cool. I don't know about that. I just wanted something to hold on to. John was so proud of those records, and Dad didn't want them. Your father didn't want them. It was sad. Jessica leaned toward her aunt and hugged her for a long time. Angela wasn't sure if her niece were crying, but knew that she was. You should get upstairs, Angela said. Then she went over to the discordant pile of CDs and looked at the list of titles on the backs and finally settled for one. As Jessica shut the upstairs door behind her, she could hear the faint sounds of Sinatra singing "Send in the Clowns." She smiled at her aunt's little bit of rebellion. So, will you indulge me for about 2 more pages? Yes. Okay. So, Johnny has driven up from a show in Baltimore, and he is going to stay in his father's apartment, which is in the same house as his older brother, whom he hasn't spoken to in 15 years. And he just gets there. There was a stairway down and a stairway up. He locked the door behind him. For better or worse, he was home. Did home really qualify? Home, Johnny reminded himself, was Oakland. Home was the Bay Area's chronic 68 degrees. Home was the coffee shop he co-owned and the record label and Ashley the calico he'd adopted 5 years ago. Home was the bus where he and Riot Shield lived months out of the year. This house where his brother lived, where his father had lived. This was no more home than the house his father had owned when he was a child had been. No more home than his house where his mother had raised him. No more home than the apartment in Tribeca where he'd lived with Charmaine. Surely he knew the streets, the grid, the neighborhoods. Surely he'd grown up with these sycamore trees and these people, but that didn't make this home. What the fuck do I know about home, he wondered. When he thought of New York, when he thought of growing up, it was not the tight neighborhoods and dirty avenues of Queens with their appliance stores and pharmacies with their laundromats and diners that came to mind. He thought of Manhattan, where he'd squandered most of the hours of his adolescence. He thought of Manhattan's towering steel and glass offices that seemed to scratch at the bellies of the clouds, and the older, stockier concrete or stone or brick homes on the side streets, the small trees planted in open squares of sidewalks. He thought of punks and junkies and girls and taxis, the long-gone checkered cabs, honking and sirens above fire engines. He thought of cops looking either way or else staring for far too long. He thought of the smell of rain on concrete and asphalt and of the steam rising sometimes from sewer caps, a particular pungent-tasting smoke. He thought of Taxi Driver and King Kong and the Taking of Pelham 123 and Annie Hall. He heard the New York Dolls, sloppy, glamorous, decadent. He heard the Ramones and Lou Reed and Paul Simon. He thought of lights at 4 a.m, street lights and window lights and stoplights, of neon signs in bar windows and the lit up signs atop taxis, the streets not quite empty, never quite empty, but as if those arteries of the city had a slower pulse rate too, at rest then. He thought graffiti portraits on subway cars, though there hadn't been graffitied cars in decades. He thought of hot dogs and knishes and pizza and dim sum and record stores and people selling art and books and jewelries and scarves and hats and knickknacks from blankets, from folding tables, from the trunks of cars. He did not think of his brother or his sister-in-law or his nieces, except in passing. Then he would tell himself no, and he would move on. Or at least he would tell himself he moved on. He breathed in deeply, set his suitcase on the landing, and walked down the stairs. He heard a sleepy voice ask, "Dad?" and he stopped for a second. Then he stepped again. "No," he said. "Oh my God," was followed by Angela's whispered voice, "Not so loud. We don't want to wake up anyone." He stepped into the doorframe and did his best Jack Nicholson. "Here's Johnny." He kept his voice low. He poked his face forward a bit, raised his eyebrows. "And," she said, looking at his sister. He hadn't seen her in years. He recognized her from the photographs, but still he wasn't expecting her to be so middle-aged. She was a bit softer than he thought she'd be. Her face had shifted from pretty to handsome, and the dark bags beneath her eyes reminded him how hard the last few days, the last 18 months had been on her. There was a lot of silver in her hair. She stood from the couch and stretched when he stepped into the doorway. He was taller than she remembered, a bit broader than his photo seemed to suggest. His hair stood nearly straight up and was pushed back like a lawn almost. The tattoos up his arm were sweat vivid. He had the same cartoon shark smile, the dimple like their father had had. "John," they hugged for a while. He kissed her cheek. "It's been too long," she said. He didn't know how to respond. He held her for a second more, felt himself relax. She could feel his muscles ease, and she released her own held breath. "I know," he said, "but this is the easy part. You look good." He stepped back and looked at the pretty girl who seemed to teeter from left foot to right. She had Malucci hair, thick and black. She wore it spiky up top and let it flow in jagged straight lines down. She had a pixie mouth that reminded him of her mother's. "Jessica?" he asked. She laughed and hugged him. "Oh my God, Johnny Malice. Uncle Johnny. Holy shit!" She pressed her body into him. It was thin and muscular and soft simultaneously, the body of the girls who tried to get backstage, the body of the girls at the front of stages, the body of the girls he'd loved when he lived in New York. I can't believe you're here. I always knew, but Dad said you would never come back. Dad said you hated us. Oh my God. He tried letting some space come into the hug and patted her back. It's okay. I don't hate anybody. Oh, God, you don't know. Aunt Angela, can you take a picture of us with my phone? No one believes me. I mean, my friends, they believe me, but not just acquaintances. I mean, I wanted to see you last year, and people thought I could just get tickets because you're my uncle, and I feel so silly. Johnny extracted himself from the girl. He sat down in his father's lazy boy. It's not silly, he smiled. She kneeled next to the chair. Aunt Angela, the phone, she insisted. Angela looked at the phone quizzically and Jess stood up, frustrated, pointed out to her aunt how to use its camera. Then she fell back down on her knees beside him. Angela looked at the image on the screen, then snapped 2 or 3 pictures. They all seemed similar. Uncle Johnny. Just Johnny is fine. Uncle Johnny, I wanted to see you at Warped Tour too, but Dad wouldn't let me, and how would I be able to see you anyway? It's okay. Your dad is like that. He thinks he's being protective. Angela watched her younger brother with the girl. The last time she'd seen him, he'd been impatient, impertinent, impractical, improper, imp. He was an imp in almost all ways, an Italian punk rock imp. Now, though, Angela realized he was a man, someone who had some fame, who dealt with kids like this often, who respected them. He was beaming. If anyone might make him feel in his comfort zone, it was their niece. And Angela, toss me my phone. Angela underhanded the phone and just caught it. I have to send these photos to some friends. Is that okay? Angela held a finger in the air. Are any of your friends likely to show up in the next half hour and wake up your mom and dad? For Johnny Malice? Yeah. Then maybe you should wait till tomorrow. Uncle Johnny, how long are you staying? Johnny let out a long burst of breath. Honestly, Jess, I don't know. I'll definitely be here through tomorrow afternoon. I have to call Georgie then and get the specifics on where she has me staying. Georgie? She's their road manager, Angela answered for him. If Jessica was surprised by how much her aunt knew about the band, she didn't seem to show it. Road manager? Georgie makes the band work. We're pretty incompetent without her. She books the hotels, works with the clubs, makes sure we get where we're supposed to be, make sure the roadies do their jobs, make sure they get paid, make sure we get paid, and when bad shit happens, she's the one with a plan. She made sure I have a suit for tomorrow. He went to stand up. Oh crap, I left my bag at the landing. I'll go get it, Jessica said, springing up. She had the limitless energy of an adolescent, and she bobbed a little on the balls of her feet. She climbed the stairs quickly and then stopped near the top. Someone was in the kitchen. She ducked her head back down and put her finger to her pursed lips. She mouthed, "Dad's upstairs." She lifted the suitcase gently and carried it back down, despite its heaviness. As Jessica walked, Johnny looked at his sister. Anthony's awake? It doesn't sound like my brother. Isn't it a sin to be up past midnight? Johnny, go easy. He's in a really bad place. John nodded. His right foot tapped its heel restlessly, as it often did. He was the expressive, nervous kind, some part of his body usually in motion. As the conversation deepened, the tempo of tapping sped up. I knew they were close, Ange. I do, and I'm here to be helpful, supportive, but I've never gotten Anthony. I don't know who he is, what he believes in, what he values. I'm sorry. You realize, she said, he would say the same thing about you. Thank you.